Hello and welcome to the second COP27 Climate Actions APAC series. I'm Rutuja Tendolkar, a partner in ERM South and Southeast Asia Business Unit. Today, along with my colleagues Sabrina, Han, and Vicky, who will be introduced in due course, we're going to discuss just transition actions. That is, what do businesses need to consider to approach net zero in a way that is equitable and fair? How do we ensure that the lives and livelihoods of workers and communities are considered as we move away from fossil fuels and pivot towards a net zero economy? Before we begin, a few house rules. The chat function is open and is being moderated. We encourage you to actively participate. The webinar is being recorded and will be published on ERM's APAC YouTube channel. Please click the live transcript and then select show subtitles for those that may want the English transcript feature. And you will have an opportunity to share your questions, feedback, and thoughts at the end of the session. Now, in yesterday's session, we heard from Lyndon, Julia, and some others on the key COP27 takeaways and its implications on APAC. There was some discussion on just transition considerations, and today's webinar is going to focus on that. We will first dive into the brass tacks of what just transition means. We will then hear from our panelists on putting this concept to practice. We will also have the pleasure of hosting a colleague who participated in the Just Transition Pavilion at COP27 on the direction or steer that is taking shape. And then we'll hear some insights to embrace just transition. During today's webinar, you will hear the panelists allude to inequality being a very persistent and systemic risk. Now, before we start, I want to present a statistic to make this feel real and visceral, and then look at it from the just transition perspective. So a recent World Business Council for Sustainable Development report called Tackling Inequality stated that the 10 richest men have amassed more wealth than the bottom 3.1 billion people in the world. Think about that while you respond to the two immediate polling questions. Tanvi, if you can help me with that, please. Okay, the first one is, which sector does your organization represent? There are several choices, if you can just select those. And you will need to scroll down to look for the second question. But the first one, please. You've got about 30 seconds to respond. Tami, can we have the results? Okay, so there's a fair bit of mix in the audience in the room. I think all the key sectors are well represented, between 6 to 10% of participants. We've also got a lot of people in the others category, which is possibly consulting, finance, etc. Let's move on to the next question. Where is your organization in its journey towards just transition? Most of you all have actually said, I have no idea on what just transition is about. So we're hoping to have you till the end of this session. And some of you have mentioned that your organization is already implementing just transition actions. To keep the chat and the questions going, we can potentially circulate what you're doing and what can be done differently as an outcome of this session. Great. So with that icebreaker, let's get into the brass tacks. On screen, we've presented 3 examples. The first example is around the whole conversation on livelihood implications when we're phasing out fossil fuels. The second example comes from Australia. You've probably heard of the Hazelwood project, which is in the process of getting decommissioned, and that has found workers and communities at crossroads. And finally, the third example is back home from India, where while of course the government is planning a lot of renewable energy development, there is still a whole lot of conversation around how large solar parks are impinging on the rights of communities, indigenous peoples, as well as creating some adverse social impacts because of their land requirement. Now, these 3 examples have 3 dimensions in common, and we're going to get into these, which we call as the energy trilemma. One is energy security. second is sustainability, and the third is around energy equity. And these three topics is what construes as the meaning or the implication of the broader concept of just transition. If we can move on, we want to focus on this topic a little more because the definition or the concept itself can be slightly vague. So like we said, energy policy across governments is getting oriented to balance these three dimensions known as the energy trilemma: energy security, energy equity, as well as sustainability. What this has meant is that as we transition our power generation sources as well as our economy towards or away from fossil fuels, we need to do that in a way that tackles the existing inequality instead of heightening it and does not add to additional impacts or injustices. So the thinking around this trilemma is what has led to the concept of just transition. Just transition is not a very articulately defined term as yet. This slide gives you a quick overview on what it is consensually sort of intended to mean. However, the idea is that, while there is an advantage in the ambiguity around the term, the blurriness can also impede action. So while the definition is evolving, there are certain underlying principles as well as considerations that are coming into play as we think about just transition and we move beyond just the workforce. The whole concept around human rights, fairness, equality, and inclusivity, decent and high value work. There's a lot of talk about the green collar workforce and what does that mean in terms of new skill sets. Ecological social well-being. This goes back to the example around renewable energy projects and the kind of adverse impacts that they may still have, as well as multi-stakeholder collaboration. Now, some of these principles may be familiar to you. You may think that there are conventional ESG safeguards as well as social risk management topics that can tackle these. However, the nuance here is to go beyond risks and opportunities, but to piece these together through a lens or a perspective of just transition, which is again focused on a fair and an equitable outcome. Therefore, in addition to being an outcome that is a fairer and climate resilient future, just transition is also a process. And this needs to be undertaken in consultation with those that are impacted by the transition to net zero. And these impacts that we will keep coming back to are threefold. Who gets adversely impacted while moving away from fossil fuels? Who gets both adversely and positively impacted by moving towards low carbon energy sources? And finally, the broader vulnerability of those that are adapting or that are currently getting impacted by the effects of climate change in terms of adaptation requirements. So moving on from ambiguity to ambition to action, the discussion on the need for a just transition perspective and framework was driven by organizations such as ILO after the Paris Agreement in 2015, with a focus on the labor markets as well as the concern linked to jobs. Not just the loss of jobs, but also on whether our economies, especially in a rural context, have the kind of skill sets that are needed to be able to be engaged within the renewable energy and other new energy sectors. Since then, successive COPs and other entities have broadened the conversation beyond just the jobs and the workforce to include topics such as gender, vulnerability of communities, as well as socioeconomic impacts of the transition. These, as a lot of you may have understood or read about, have culminated into the parties agreeing to a landmark milestone at COP27 with the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund. So the Loss and Damage Fund is a funding arrangement in a nutshell, which seeks to channel financial support towards vulnerable economies that are actually facing or adapting to the devastating impacts from climate change. We understand that the details of these will be worked out through a transitional committee that has been set up in COP27, and that will further have several working groups as we get into COP28. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We have a whole session on COP27 in just a minute. So in a nutshell, what is clear is that a lot of the framing around what just transition means in practice requires government action. However, that does not mean that businesses who are actually driving the transition by injecting money into the financial system need to wait. There is a lot to navigate in the meanwhile. And to help us get into those discussions, I'm now joined by my colleagues who will be discussing what just transition means in practice. Sabrina and Han, can you come on and introduce yourselves and elaborate your role a little bit in the just transition conversation?
Thanks, Rutuja, for the introduction. So I'm Sabrina Genter. I'm a partner with the business, and despite the very strong American accent you might be hearing through your computer or through your headphones, I've actually been based in Perth in Western Australia for the last 20 years. My primary focus is helping organizations particularly understand the social aspects of the just transition, be they the human rights implications or the impacts that communities may be experiencing. And as some of us like to say, like you and I, Rutuja, is probably putting a face to the decarbonization discussion. Over to you, Han.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Han Nguyen from EM Vietnam. Over the past 20 years, I also had a chance to work in the development, sustainable development field, to work with government, policymaker, NGO, academia, in different alternative development paradigms, such as inclusive growth, people-centered development models, environmental justice. And in my recent 5 years, as a sustainability consultant, I support projects in accelerating social performance, social due diligence, corporate social responsibility, ESG, human rights. So I think it's interesting that all of these concepts are really interconnected and partly converge into our discussion topic today in energy just transition. So I'm happy to have a chance to talk with you to have an insightful discussion on the topic today. Thank you.
Thanks, Han and Sabrina. And just for everyone's benefit, Han, Sabrina, and I, we are part of about 60 plus social and human rights practitioners across APAC who've been dealing with these questions and concerns. So, do reach out to us on LinkedIn at any point. So, Sabrina, the first question is for you. We just spoke about how the definition of just transition is evolving. It's still very nebulous, and while it is an advantage in some instances, because it's blurry, there isn't too much of guidance. So in that context, what have you seen businesses doing as they navigate the momentum around just transition?
It's a great jumping off point. And Rutuja, and maybe the audience stole a little bit of my thunder, but I think in terms of, if you look back at the first question that we posed, where people were probably sitting at two ends of the spectrum when it comes to what they're doing around the just transition. So a big part of it is some organizations are pretty well advanced in their thinking, and other organizations are just getting started in their thinking. And probably over the last 5 to 10 years, we've heard a lot of discussions around net zero commitments, moving into decarbonization strategies, looking at what are the transition risks to assets and projects or to companies full stop. Also looking around the physical risks, so changing climatic conditions and what that means for organizations. And as you mentioned, Rutuja, and I won't steal Vicky's thunder just yet, but with COP27, we saw for the first time a dedicated tent to the just transition. So although we've been looking at a lot at what does it mean from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective and how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we can drive decarbonization, one of the things we're really starting to see are the social and environmental risks, but also the opportunities that are presented through the decarbonization process for organizations. So starting to see companies similar to what we would have probably seen over the last 10 years in sustainability is in some instances setting up dedicated or cross-functional teams to be looking at and pulling together the many disciplines that need to be involved in making decisions around decarbonization. Others, because we were seeing that their decarbonization strategy is actually underpinning their business strategy, we're also seeing, again, more and more broader and broader teams getting involved in the decarbonization strategy, so that we're thinking about not only the risks, but also the opportunities that are presented. And when we think about decarbonization, one that really jumps out to me is when we think about offsets. We may not get there with some of the technological advances in the timeframes that we want, so we'll be thinking about offsets. But if we think about a carbon offset, there's opportunities to protect against biodiversity loss. And there's a lot of dialogue now around net positive, but also what are the community benefits that can be driven by protecting, biodiversity when it comes to jobs or other opportunities for local communities, particularly as you mentioned, Rutuja, regional communities where we may actually have land that can be dedicated to an offset. But also as we think about other renewable opportunities, introducing that into the energy stream, thinking about the environmental and social opportunities there as well. So not limited to just something like offsets, but there's multitude of opportunities that are presented, not just managing our risks as organizations. So I think setting up some of those cross collaboration, pulling in more perspectives, but also what we're seeing is probably a lot of collaboration. So I've talked a little bit about collaboration within a company or an organization, but we're seeing a lot of, as Han mentioned before, a lot of cross collaboration across industries or sectors, but also outside of that. So looking at, it's a whole of world problem, it's a whole world response, looking at those collaboration opportunities to drive innovation, to respond to stakeholder expectations, but really to work together to identify those risks and opportunities that are presented for communities, but also for the environment that are presented when we think about decarbonization.
Thanks, Sabrina. I'm going to come back to you on sectors in a minute, but before that, Han, you've been at the forefront of leading a lot of renewable energy development projects in Vietnam, Taiwan, and other parts of Asia. What have you seen in terms of just transition in practice in that context of greenfield renewable energy transition?
Thank you very much, Rutuja. Yes, I guess the APEC regions already experienced vastly in just transitions because it urgent missions toward decarbonizations. My work in this field might be also try to frame this reality, these practicalities. Then I try to use the actor network framework to really to see different networks and how the processes that happen in the practice. So we see a lot of changes, particularly at the world level. It's not just it now moving to the multi-stakeholder collaboration that Sabrina mentions, but also the fairness, the equity, the inclusiveness, and particularly the regenerative mindsets. And we also see the rapidly evolving legal landscape with the ESG framework or the human rights and the business or also the supply chain due diligence. All of this really impacted on the operation at the national level, at the business level, and at the community level. At the national level, we can see a lot of national initiative. We can see the nationally determined contributions, but also if you look at Vietnam and Indonesia, the two countries really heavily dependent on the coal power. Now they have different national initiative to really to move from the coal and speed up the development of renewables. And also we can see the civil society also very active in at the grassroots levels when they have workshops, we have different initiatives really to foster or to enhance the community relations, community network, share benefits, or at the employees the decent work or also the employee voice within this process. For the business, we can see that the promotion of the ESG practice is now very much on the business operation, particularly the big player within the landscape. But also the other thing like the responsive consumption or supply chain management would be the other term. So I guess as Sabrina mentions, is it not just minimize the negative impact, but also the maximize positive opportunity. As I see the practices is to act as early as possible, because this link to really understand the context, have at the national and also the business level to map the political economy of the energy transition, to have the roadmap for this, and how to analyze and have different measures with the negative and positive impacts of the transition. I very much focus on the development of communication strategies, as Sabrina mentioned, the collaborations. So this is very much on developing communication strategies and the involvement of the communities, of the different stakeholders, the business, the labor within the development of communications, and then implementation of just transition measure. Yeah.
Thanks, Han, for that. I'm going to incorporate some of the questions that have come through Sabrina and Han in the next question. So specifically, how are sectors gearing up? One of the questions was around how we've seen that there are a lot of actions around phasing out of coal-fired power plants. But what are other industries and extractive industries in particular around mining doing within their 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways? Is there any concrete examples that you can share, Sabrina?
I think mining's probably a classic example, and Rutuja and Han have already touched on coal-fired power stations, both the coal mining aspect of it as well as the power station aspect of it. And a real focus, given I'm based in Australia, it's a hot topic of conversation, and one that we've seen a real focus on in terms of wanting to move towards a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But one of the things that's now being talked about, and within the context of just transition, is what does that actually mean for the communities that are dependent on either the coal-fired power stations or the coal mines in terms of workforce, and what's going to happen with those communities who may be dependent on those assets or those operations. And so a lot of planning is now going into, which is not new to the mining industry, and it's something that we've done for a long time, is as you close a mine or as you close a plant, what does that mean, and how do you actually help that community move forward and transition into its next life? And we've seen some really great examples of repurposing existing land uses and repurposing them for renewable energy, either introduction of batteries or solar farms or wind farms. So repurposing some of the land that's historically been used for other forms of energy, and then also supporting the communities that are associated with those in terms of workforce planning and what does that mean for the skill sets for those communities. So I think there's a lot of really great examples out there where that work is in progress, but we can also look back at where we've done it before in the industry, where we've had technological disruptors that have changed the way an industry has looked, and how we actually helped a workforce or a community through what those changes look like. So again, I think one of the things that'll probably come through is that some of these concepts aren't new. We're just probably needing to do them at scale at a slightly quicker pace than we probably have had to do them in the past. So helping those communities and how they transition moving forward.
Thanks, Sabrina. And Han, specifically from the renewable energy sector, any good practice examples of what good looks like that you can share with the audience?
Yeah, thank you, I guess Sabrina just mentioned on the transition out, really how to ease this from the mining, the thermal power plants. So my focus is very much on the transition in with the renewables developments. So from the beginning, I mentioned about the actor network paradigm or theory thinking. So it's not just mentioned about the humans actor within the network, but also the non-human actors. So the non-human actors very much on the renewables. When we mention about the technology, when we mention about the infrastructure, financing, all of these stuff would be very much to enhance the development of the renewable sector. Now we look at the Asian Pacific. Many reports mentions the outperformance compared with other regions on the development of renewables, and this is also the case in developing countries and other countries like in Vietnam or Indonesia in the last 4 or 5 years. So I guess there also the transition within the sector from very much on the solar power development, on the onshore power, wind power. Now there also a lot of opportunity for the offshore power development, particularly in Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan. I guess our experience have 3 lessons learned that we can take from the development of the renewable so far, and it also have implications for the just transition. The first one is stakeholder engagement, and very often many projects just have a very late or not sufficient stakeholder engagement. They're not able to map stakeholder timely, and they don't have really the plan for stakeholder engagement, particularly affected communities. In some projects like the wind farm, many of them would be in the remote area or in the coastal area where a lot of ethnic minority people live there, indigenous people live there. So the unsuccessful engagement with this community will be in the long term would be have negative impact for the project development. So with taking the just transition within the stakeholder engagement, we can see that the just transition planning should also engage in very as early as possible the voices, the perceptions of the affected communities, particularly the vulnerable household, vulnerable groups, ethnic minority groups. The second issue or that we see is the supply chains management. So when we look at the renewables, it's not only look at the labor issue within the projects or the indirect workers, but also the supply chains. And the development of solar, for example, can be looked through the supply chain to see if any problems with the child labor, with the forced labor, and it bring all of this into the project's supply chains management. And the third one would be, as you mentioned earlier, the livelihood restoration, the income development, and the skill uplifting of the affected community. So all of these coming up in the renewable project, we can see a lot of efforts so far under the EIG to really support the affected community to have their livelihood restored equal to or better than their time at the phase of project development. But also, if we look at the just transition, is also wider perspective when we engage in with the skill uplifting of the affected community. If we look at Vietnamese, then we can see the first wave of skill change of these affected community from farmers to industrial worker. Now, with the just transition, this is the second move or the second wave of changing. Now we have to support them really diverse in different sector, and it's not just only in the thermal plants to renewable projects, but also the other link with the agribusiness, tourism development, other sector within a more broader view of the economic development. Yeah.
Thanks, Han. I'm sure these discussions have fueled a lot of thought. Keep your questions coming. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on. I see that we've got Vicky Copeman in the room. Vicky was part of COP27, the ERM contingent that was represented there. And she is now going to take the next part of the session in terms of insights from COP27 in the context of just transition actions. Over to you, Vicky.
Thanks, Rutuja. And hello, everyone. I guess it's good afternoon, even good evening for some of you. I'm here in London. It hasn't got light yet, but I'm up when that's the main thing. So I'm a partner here at ERM, and I've really built my career around the interface between communities and companies, working on areas like social performance, social license to operate, delivering social value. And I was privileged enough to go along to COP27. It was my first COP. Many of you may have already gone to COP, so you know kind of what the experience is like. And I focused there very much on the dialogue on just transition, given my background. So I think that it is really important, as we begin to reflect on the African COP, to sit in the really uncomfortable reality of our unequal world some more. So if we can go to the next slide, that would be super. Yeah, thank you very much. And I know Rutuja raised this at the beginning of the session with you. And although the prevalence of extreme poverty has mercifully dropped fairly dramatically over the last, hundreds of years, and measures of well-being have improved, the current distribution of income and wealth, as you can see on the slide, is extremely unequal and leaves hundreds of millions of people struggling to meet their basic needs. A number of major trends and developments in our world are making the problem worse. Climate change, our theme today, destruction of ecosystem services, soil degradation, technological disruption, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic all hit the most vulnerable the hardest. You can see on the graph there, basically the increase in wealth between 1995 and 2021 against the existing wealth of the individual. And you can see that there has been a bit of a squeezed middle over that period of time, over there in sort of the higher middle income earners. But then you can see the skyrocketing of those, the 10 highest earners, and of course all the other high earners that sit in that kind of 99.9 percentile and upwards. Now, it's not just actual poverty, it's also inequality of wealth and of opportunity that drives dissatisfaction and disillusionment. And this presents us with a systemic risk. You can see on the slides, on the circles on the bottom here, the kinds of things that we see in our society. The eroding of social cohesion and diminishing trust in key institutions can both fuel civil and political unrest. This instability itself increases the damage that crises can cause. And really importantly, it undermines our collective capacity to tackle complex global challenges. And we have some complex global challenges to face. So let's move to the next slide, as we sit in that kind of very uncomfortable but real context. I think with that context, it's for all of us to kind of celebrate, I guess, the growing emphasis on just transition that I certainly experienced at COP27. Let me try and review the kind of plethora of information and distill it down a little bit. So at COP27, just transition was across many of the conversations. Of course, it was a theme, as Rutuja was mentioning, in the Conference of the Parties, the COP, which is the government negotiations, where loss and damage dominated the proceedings. In the so-called blue zone, where I spent most of my time, again, as mentioned, the ILO pavilion was called the Just Transition Pavilion and was co-sponsored by the EU. And here the conversation did focus on jobs, as you would expect, and employment practices, worries about the loss of jobs as transition goes forward, and also that some of the old jobs that maybe are being lost in coal mining, oil and gas, were considered good jobs. Generally, often included a recognition of collectivization, so the role of unions. So I'm just going to turn my phone off, which is coming in unusually with lots of beeps at this time in the morning. And a concern really that the green jobs coming in may have lower levels of standards and may not have that right for collective bargaining that obviously the ILO would be very concerned about. And you see this reflected in the ILO quote on the slide. However, the Just Transition was not just limited to the Just Transition Pavilion. It headlined across many of the country pavilions. So I'd call out the German, the Danish pavilion, also the Brazilian and Malaysian pavilion. I attended some really interesting talks. Also discussions by private sector organisations such as IPECA, WBCSD, many of you may be members of those organisations, had Just Transition themed events, and the WBCSD launched a Just Transition framework for piloting in the energy and agribusiness sector, first of all. And individual companies, and I'll call out SSE here, which is a private sector UK-based energy company, showcase their Just Transition strategy. Sometimes the Just Transition events were standalone, but quite often they were woven into topics. And Sabrina mentioned a few of these already today, such as how to take forward natural climate solutions, voluntary carbon markets, how to take and integrate Just Transition into decarbonisation strategies and consider it in technology selection. Put it this way, I was at COP for 4 days, 4 fairly overwhelming days, and I was focused on Just Transition. And there were lots of overlapping events which I could have attended if I could have found them. I think many of you have probably heard, or even if you were there, experienced the complexity of finding different events. The conversation, both at the pavilions and in individual conversations, was diverse. There was some talk about what a Just Transition is, and if it's a good term, people saying, is it just a transition? Is it a transition, but only just? Kind of, I guess, fairly humorous observations like that. But generally, the conversation was quite a lot more serious. Let me try and summarize the kind of main themes, I guess, that came out. The first was connected very much with the challenges I talked through earlier of societal disillusionment. And what came out, and I think, again, we've heard this from maybe Han just earlier, was the need to set a very positive framing around energy transition. The dialogue really needs to move from not about what we can't do, of course that will be there, but about what we can do and about looking forward to the world we want to live in. You can see that again in the quote. It's about taking forward a transition that has something positive in it for everybody, such that there can be enthusiasm at all levels. That's when we will accelerate. The next theme was about Just Transition being stakeholder-centric. Again, Han brought in that real importance of stakeholder engagement. An energy sector speaker who's with a US energy distribution company really told her story. She was explaining that it's becoming increasingly hard to upgrade the infrastructure in disadvantaged communities. They've had enough of companies coming in and disrupting their lives. And so she really looked at this with her team, and they started to change their employment practices to bring in a much more diverse employees into their workforce. That helped them to understand the communities that they were going to go and work in and respond to their needs and their requirements and listen to them. That was really interesting. It was, and she said, just to read out the quote, that you need to take forward a conversation where we co-create solutions with communities. And she emphasized that only if we, and the way that we do this will dictate the speed of decarbonisation we can take forward. Now, this really resonated with me because I've just finished a project here in the UK where we looked at the social challenges and innovations required for a rapid decarbonisation in what is our biggest industrial decarbonisation cluster, or biggest industrial cluster, our biggest emitting cluster, which is called the Humber, which is in the area called the Humber. And one thing we heard over and again from stakeholders that we engaged with was that you need to take forward decarbonisation with people and not do it to people. So this really resonated with what I heard from this energy company. The third area of emphasis across many conversations was that Just Transition is extremely different in different locations. It really needs to be locally specific. For some, it's about transitioning jobs. For others, it's about food security. Now, COP27 was tagged as the implementation COP, and this was reflected in the many panel sessions that focused on energy transition planning, technologies and implementations. And again, I think again, I'm sort of reaffirming some of the things that my colleagues have said. I think Sabrina was talking about bringing social elements into the table in our energy transition planning. And that happened at COP. One participant said on a panel, there are no humans in TCFD, in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And there's a growing consciousness that companies' transition plans need to be based, yes, on a consideration of carbon reduction, but also to ensure that actions are biodiversity positive and support a just transition. Speaking with colleagues in ERM, there is certainly emerging best practice in this area. For example, we can bring societal and political elements into our scenario analysis to understand risks and opportunities. We can consider community and societal elements in considering what decarbonisation pathways to go down. And we can also make sure that societal and community elements are central to how we take forward these decarbonisation pathways. So lots, I've given you lots. So let me try and pip it down one more time. If I had to pick 3 takeaways, they'd be the following. Firstly, although originally focused exclusively on the rights of workers a number of COPs ago, the concept of just transition has grown to encompass much wider considerations, including the impacts on households and communities, and particularly those facing poverty and those vulnerable to immediate climate threats such as sea level rise, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss, and also the threats from the energy transition itself. Secondly, that we need to cast just transition, the just transition conversation positively. We have an incredible opportunity to ensure that the flows of investment that are going to need to underpin the energy transition serve to reduce inequality between and within countries and to move us forward to realise and go beyond the SDGs. And finally, the how we go about this is just as important as the what. I'll come back to this in just a slide or so where I come across, where I'll just finish on radical collaboration. Now, I've spent most of my time talking about this, so I'm just going to flick up the next 2 slides and you'll be able to browse them hopefully at your leisure. So as we move forward to taking forward just transition, we will of course need to build business cases in our various ways with companies and in companies. It's not just about the dialogue that I showed you earlier. There is regulation coming into place, the kind of ratings that we might be judged against with ESG benchmarking, also bringing in just transition elements. I'd call out the Climate and Energy Benchmark, Climate Action 100, World Benchmarking Alliance. Access to finance, green finance will be increasingly tagged to just transition principles. And any of us who worked kind of on the interface of community and business know the importance of building trust. Han talked about this, really building that dialogue, the idea that we're all in it together. That will be extremely important. And then I've just flashed up here the JET2 partnerships, just to make you aware of them if you're not already aware of them. And these and other kind of multilateral, bilateral programs will drive opportunities for the right companies. So they're active now in South Africa, where they first started, also in APAC, Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. And they have 3 goals, as you can see here: early decommissioning of coal-fired power plants, financing decarbonisation, and delivery of a just transition. So companies that have just transition frameworks and strategies will be in a good place to maximise the benefit from these very significant, we're talking billions of dollars of finance that will be flowing in. So just on my last slide, we've talked a lot and my colleagues talk through some of the practical examples that they've seen companies taking to move forward the just transition in their company and in the societies that they're operating in. Now, it all sounds quite complex. Social issues always are quite complex, but the steps are fairly tried and tested. So I thought I'd just show this so that we can sort of all breathe out and go, yeah, I have practical ways to take this forward. So it's about reviewing your context, understanding the just transition changes that will come, understanding your stakeholders' perspective, and identifying priorities. And my colleagues have talked through some of those priorities that might emerge. For example, if you're closing down facilities, divesting assets, needing to move your supply chains, if you've got communities that are impoverished on the doorstep, perhaps with no access to energy. So some of the priorities may be fairly obvious. Also, our ability to influence governments to bring in facilitating frameworks and policies. Then embedding that, really embedding it in the narrative, empowering our people to make change happen. The importance of tailoring a strategy to the local needs, really engaging from the bottom up. And finally, supporting best practice, really embedding the tools and then sharing them beyond our companies so that we can really drive a momentum. And I'm going to finish what I'm saying just with this kind of I guess the phrase that's really going to live with me most from COP, which is this term radical collaboration. I love both words. And I see this as really our need to seek new partnerships, new ways of working, being transparent and considering how we're working together at every stage, whether that's with communities, other companies, with government, with civil society. I think we need to live in questions like, how is this going to reduce inequality? How can I drive that forward? Can this action be replicated and expanded? And how can I share that knowledge? And how are we showing up as leaders? And how can we empower each other? So it was a pretty big experience for me. I think I'm still decompressing. And my job now is to take what I've learned and share it with yourselves and also with my colleagues and really help us to embed a just transition strategy. Thank you. Thanks, Rutuja.
Thanks a lot, Vicky. I think it's clear that we all need to take from your end to embrace just transition. We've got a final polling question before we get into Q&A. And while that polling question comes up, if Han and Sabrina can think of one more recommendation from their end respectively. So the question is, what can businesses do to enable a just transition? It's a bit of a trick question. Let's see what you come up with. Moderating these polls are better on Mentimeter because you can see the number of people chiming in. Here, we just have to wait for the magic to happen behind the scenes. So about 30 seconds more to go. Okay, Tanvi, can we have the results up? So as expected, all of the above was the most favored option. The trick here was to also look at whether people could sense a sort of prioritization across the actions and coming to the fore. So Sabrina and Han, any final thoughts on how we embrace just transition from your perspective, in addition to what the action plan that Vicky laid out?
I think probably maybe not additional, but I think just re-emphasizing. I know I mentioned kind of industry collaboration, but I think Vicky, you've said it really well around the radical collaboration and collaboration with stakeholders and communities. Given that a lot of our conversations around decarbonization do require an understanding of the local context and what's important there, but also the complexities and the potential risks at a local level. And then how do we actually scale those up? So I think probably just re-emphasizing, and something I didn't really bring up before, just around that piece around the not just collaborating across industry or with industry players, but with local stakeholders and local communities to understand how they're being impacted, and how you take on board their feedback and their understanding, but also what they want to see happen in their local area.
Thanks, Sabrina. Han?
Yeah, for me, it's very important. Just transitions should go beyond the workplace boundary of businesses, involving the communities within this transition process, and how we engage them different phases from planning to implementations. Transition measures is very important, and we can see within the landscape the champions of the just transitions. So how really the feedback, the learning loop to be developed would be also highlighted from my point of view.
Thanks, Han. Let's go into Q&A. Maybe, Han, if I can come back to you with a question that's come up from Jiang. So could you elaborate on the link between just transition and human rights?
Yeah, this is very interesting questions. I guess the business and human rights, when we integrate into the just transition, is very important in terms of conceptual and also practical point of view. It can bring a wide awareness of a wider range of impacts. It's not just in the workplace, but also, as I mentioned earlier, it can be the wider communities, different phases of planning and implementations. And when we bring the human rights perspectives, it can ensure the different stakeholders to access information and meaningful participation within this decision-making process. I think the second point would be the human rights due diligence. The human rights due diligence can offer a very practical tool for business, also in a wider justice process that we can engage in not just community, but also indigenous people, gender perspective. So this is a practical one. And the last would be when we integrate the existing business human rights into the just transition, we can screen the current practice of the business, any adverse human rights implication for the vulnerable people, for the affected community. Then we can understand the just transitions into the value chains, into the business relationship, and we can have a better human rights and development outcomes.
Thanks, Han, for that. I'll go to Bhavin's question next, and Sabrina, maybe this one's for you. We've discussed about local communities and people. What about just transition for other flora, fauna aspects of our ecosystem, biodiversity?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and one Vicky touched on a bit around, and even I did a little bit at the start around net positive, and we have a lot of discussions. You know, we've got TCFD and now TNFD, so Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which, as Vicky pointed out, TCFD doesn't have humans, but definitely TNFD does have flora and fauna at the heart of it. And there's a lot of not just risks of our as we look at decarbonization opportunities, there's risks to biodiversity, but there's also plenty of opportunities that exist. And the one I mentioned really around offsets is looking at how do we actually maximize some of the biodiversity or nature opportunities that exist there to create, not only protect the values, but also enhance them. There's a really interesting piece as well, which we haven't really touched on, but with changing climatic conditions, we're seeing impacts on water and resources being available. So I think that's another one where, again, it's adding to the complexity of some of the conversations that we're having when we're thinking about biodiversity. It's not biodiversity in isolation, but what are the changing climatic conditions and more water or less water available for those? And then what does that mean when, you know, we've got competing for some of the operations that we work at or the projects that we work on, when they need water and there's competing, be it the cultural heritage values that are attached to that water resource, or the social demand for that in terms of drinking water, or the water that's needed to maintain the biodiversity values of an area. How do we actually think about that when we're thinking about decarbonization in the future? And we need to start factoring in all those multitude of considerations when we think about not just the decarbonization, but what does the future actually look like with the changing climatic conditions that we are experiencing.
Thanks, Sabrina. Vicky, a question that I may ask you to field. This is from Matthias. Technology/IT has less visible impacts or visible impacts to ESG. How can we define our impacts and define our mission goals and activities to address technology field-related impacts?
It's a really good question for those of us who aren't working totally at that interface directly. with communities to understand how we can enter into this conversation. We've actually got quite a live project going on in the UK, and I'm not part of it. I'm not going to go into any detail at all, but it's for a company that's looking at satellites. It's a satellite company. And so they basically looked at understanding their purpose in the world. So they went right back to the kind of business strategy, and that's where I'd recommend you look. And so it's about connecting people. It's about providing information. It might be geospatial, might be communication. I'm not actually too sure the kind of data that they provide. So it's about connecting people. So then they can start thinking about, okay, so if we're looking to connect people, how can we make sure that we can put in bits to our technology that is going to allow perhaps more vulnerable people, less advantaged people to connect. So that might be how geospatially they cover the earth, the information that they can provide, etc., as well as kind of signaling that to their kind of interface people of how they want that technology or some of the applications that that technology can provide. So they went back to we're still working with them, but I think the basis is like connecting people together. And so from that, then you can start having the thoughts going off. And I think what's really nice is when you come up with these ideas is obviously to engage a lot internally. I'm sure many of you do that, so that you really enroll your workforce into the mission of the company or part of the mission of the company, which in this case can be perhaps around something like connecting people.
Thanks, Vicky. I've just got about a couple of questions left. This one's from Indradi. Maybe I'll attempt to answer it myself. It's a long question, so excuse the. So US President Joe Biden and Indonesian President Joko Widodo announced the climate finance deal known as the Just Energy Transition Partnership worth $20 billion. What do you think private plus commercial banks should do to tap into this opportunity from a blended finance point of view? So I think in our everyday finance sector conversations, we've obviously seen the DFIs, such as the World Bank, that are trying to pilot as well as implement what they call accelerating climate transition programs. There's a fund right now in India, for example, which is focused on the public sector coal power plants. We've also seen the GFANZ, which is the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has got commercial banks like Macquarie, HSBC, Citi, etc. And they are really going to start developing a blueprint on where their green finance frameworks can come in the context of the priority countries where JETPs are being established. And at a private equity or an asset manager level, we're also seeing PE funds come up with decarbonization strategy as an investment thesis. So they are going to potentially fund or look for investment opportunities across any sectors where there is an element of decarbonization involved. So I'm sure the session that we're going to have on climate finance, I think it's in a couple of days, we'll definitely have more insights on your question, Indradi. Okay, so I don't see any more questions. There was just one last bit, and maybe Sophia, this one's for you, on whether we can share examples that ERM has done on what good looks like. Maybe since this is such an important topic to sort of have consensus around, this is something we can focus on ERM's website and put out some case studies. But our sustainability report that came out earlier this year definitely has some examples linked to low carbon energy transition as well as multi-stakeholder participation. So do have a look at that report. Great. So just a reminder again, please register for the upcoming dialogues on digital nature-based solutions, climate finance, as well as renewable energy onshore and offshore. We've also got a link for those of you who want to provide your feedback on this specific webinar on Just Transition Action. You can just use the QR code that's on your screen. And with that, we're signing off. Thank you for everybody's time and for joining this session. I'm going to end with a quote that one of our bright young consultants came up with as we were sort of preparing the session, which is, as we commit to ways and means towards a sustainable and climate neutral future, let's make sure that this transition is one that is of the people, for the people, and by the people. So with that, goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.